The crisis of the 3rd century. What was the crisis? And why did it happen? This video is done in collaboration with our friends over at the Eastern Roman Histories YouTube channel. In this first part, we explore the causes of the crisis, and in the second video over on the Eastern Roman Histories channel, we explore the reasons how Rome eventually survived the crisis. In the decades leading up to the crisis, the power balance between the Senate in Rome, which nominally elevated the emperor to his position, and the imperial army, had shifted, and power now lay firmly in the hands of the army. No longer was the emperor a princeps, first among equals. Now he was a successful general who had promised donatives to his soldiers when they proclaimed him emperor. Septimius Severus placated the military on an unprecedented scale and essentially bought their loyalty through increased pay and other measures. He raised a soldier's pay from 300 to 500 denarii annually, and to pay his soldiers, he debased the currency by adding less precious metal to the coinage. Although this initial debasement did not cause any immediate economic concerns, it set a precedent for later emperors to follow. Furthermore, by playing to the military, Severus weakened the traditional standing of the role of the emperor and took the first steps to make the position entirely dependent on the loyalty of the army. Even though the emperor had always relied on the support of the military to one degree or another, the courting of the military by the emperors became far more pronounced, and the importance of the Senate was greatly reduced. The Severan dynasty itself fell due to its last emperor, Severus Alexander, failing to placate the army. The soldiers had him murdered and installed a military man, Maximinus Thrax, in his stead. And that was the beginning of a trend for the next 5 decades. Disgruntled soldiers promoting one of their commanders to the imperial throne by promises of wealth and favours. This was also exacerbated by the fact that the empire saw invasions during the same period on an unprecedented scale, which demanded executive command on many different frontier regions of the empire at the same time. So the soldiers would promote their general to emperor so he could concentrate on protecting their part of the empire. That's one of the reasons why Gaul seceded from the empire. The external threat to the empire was also much greater than it had been in previous decades. The Sassanid Persian Empire, which had supplanted the Parthians in the east, proved to be a much more aggressive and effective adversary for Rome. And the northern tribes across the Danube and Rhine had by now had centuries of contact with Rome, and had gradually developed in a variety of ways in response to Rome, and in part their development was a direct result of Roman incentives. Roman diplomatic practice treated all partners to bilateral interaction as if they possessed institutional structures equivalent to Rome's, and no doubt prolonged exchanges of this kind caused institutional development along lines consonant, if not wholly harmonious, with Roman expectations. And smaller tribes that had long bordered Roman lands in Germany had coalesced into more formidable federations, such as the Franks and the Alemanni. The Goths had also arrived on the Danube frontier and would prove to be a prolonged problem in the area. Ardashir's new Persian Empire had already penetrated Roman territory in 230, and that was only the beginning. Across the next half-century, Rome would reap what it had sown. Foreign military forces would make a mockery of the frontiers, crossing the Rhine and Danube in violence, sailing the Hellespont, and sacking the cities of Syria and the east. The empire experienced profound stress along many frontiers at once, on a more or less unprecedented scale. The long series of those attacks caused a crisis of manpower that was, again, nearly unprecedented. Coming on the heels of the Antonine Plague, made response and recovery extraordinarily difficult, which was worsened by the Cyprian Plague that claimed the life of the emperors Hostilian and Claudius Gothicus. The crisis on multiple fronts exposed and exacerbated the related military and political weaknesses of the empire's structures of governance. The empire desperately needed military leadership on multiple fronts at the same time. Good generals, to say the least, with the power of command extending across provinces to coordinate action along an entire frontier. But, because the system made every successful general into a potential emperor, overarching commands were perceived as dangerous to imperial self-interest. Such special commands had been given out in previous decades, but only under strong emperors, and then often to members of the imperial family or commanders with unquestionable loyalty. The empire lacked a strong emperor at the onset of the crisis. The last strong emperor was Septimius Severus decades earlier, and as we've seen, he exacerbated the problem in his own way. Attempts were made of creating stability, but the last two Severan emperors were mere boys, who seemed to have been dominated by their mothers and grandmother. The ongoing military problem caused an economic crisis. The Roman Empire employed a precious metal monetary system in which the value of coins was notionally tied simultaneously to the quantity of precious metal in them and the rate at which the central government would exchange bronze coins for silver and silver for gold. And with the already raised salaries of the army and the need to promise massive donatives, caused further inflation, which triggered further debasement of the currency, and an evil spiral began. But it was not as bleak as sometimes portrayed. The debasement did not seem to trigger exactly proportional inflation, but that does not mean it was not a sign of trouble. Debasement clearly testifies to a need on the part of the central government for money, which it could not meet with normal means of taxation, and locally, the population lost faith in the currency they were using. And naturally, the increased military activity and a failure to maintain the borders of the empire decreased internal trade, and the increased profiteering of bandits and pirates, which made the economic situation worse. Herodian tells us that harsh tax raising in the days of Maximinus Thrax raised an unprecedented uproar, and ultimately led to the rebellions of 238. With the apparent failure of the Roman Empire to maintain its hegemony, many came to question if the traditional Roman gods had abandoned them, and naturally their mistrust grew against the Jews, and especially the Christians, who refused to sacrifice for the prosperity of the state. So emperors would introduce edicts that forced everyone to sacrifice for the prosperity of the state and the emperor, and when they refused, they would be thrown to the lions and their property seized. In summary, the crisis consisted of several major points: the growing power of the armies, problems with the legitimacy and the ideological basis of imperial power, the collapse of the existing monetary system, a religious and moral crisis, invasions of foreign peoples in practically all border regions, and even beyond into the heartlands of the empire, and the change from the rule of an emperor to that of a military despot. All of that caused the deterioration of public services and general instability. All of these factors are linked, and many of these factors don't start during the crisis of the 3rd century, but it seems that they culminated during that period, or at least were exacerbated. 3 of the most profound and lasting effects of the crisis of the 3rd century was the disruption of Rome's extensive internal trade network and the diminished importance of the Senate. Senators were no longer allowed to govern provinces or lead troops. The veneer of the old republic had finally truly fallen. The empire was now led by a military despot, and there was no need to placate the Senate, since emperors spent more and more time away from Rome, which leads to the 3rd point. With the emperors spending more time along the frontier regions of the empire, the city of Rome's importance began to diminish. The imperial court and government apparatus would instead follow the ruler to the area which required his presence. This period could have conceivably marked the premature end of the Roman Empire, but instead it proved to be a transitional period in Roman history. Robert Latouche writes, "After the reign of the Severi, we seem to plunge into a long tunnel, to emerge only at the beginning of the late Empire under Diocletian, and when we step out again into daylight, unfamiliar country lies all about us." And to some extent, that is true. The classical world is no more, and we find ourselves in a foreign land, late antiquity. The tunnel Latouche refers to is the lack of reliable sources to draw from. The empire undergoes a tremendous transformation, but we know very little about the details. In the second part of this video, over on Eastern Roman History's YouTube channel, we explore how the Roman state eventually mended and recovered from this crisis, so be sure to check that out, And thanks to Eastern Roman History for collaborating with us on this video. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy the content, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It helps us tremendously. Thanks again, and see you in the next one.